Rasul, it's good to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, why don't you tell me a little bit about what you're doing right now in your ministry?
Sure. So I'm on staff with crew with the millennial team in New York City. So we get to help millennials figure out how to live out their faith on their jobs, just as they do life in their neighborhoods, especially in a place like New York, where that could be a bit challenging. So I do that, and I also am a teaching pastor at the Bridge Church in New York City in Brooklyn.
Okay, how long have you been doing that?
2.5 years.
Okay.
Yeah, it's been quite an adjustment to the city, but it's a great place to live, to work, to do ministry. So I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, New York City is like the ultimate city. Where were you before that?
Indiana.
Indiana.
So very similar.
Yeah, quite an adjustment. Yeah, well, that's cool. Well, recently I heard you tell a story about a woman named Elizabeth Eckford.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about her story and her first day of school?
Sure. So Elizabeth Eckford was going to her first day in a new high school, September 4th, 1957. She that morning got up and, just like many of us that first day of high school, trying to figure out what you're going to wear, are the teachers and my fellow classmates going to like me, that kind of thing. But there was something unique about this particular day. Okay. She was one of what would later be known as the Little Rock Nine, who were going to desegregate Little Rock Central High School. Okay. This was one of the first attempts to do this in the South after the Brown versus Board of Education. Now, because her family didn't have a phone, she wasn't aware of the fact that the other 8 students had decided not to go that day in light of just a lot of hearing about some unrest and some angry protests that were going to be, waiting for them at the school. And in fact, that there were going to be troops and all that. Well, she didn't get that memo. So when she went, it was her by herself. Only one, no parents. And, she's surrounded by an angry mob who are shouting things at her like, go back to Africa. We don't want you here. All sorts of racial slurs at her. And there's this iconic image that we see of her, holding her books with sunglasses and just surrounded in this, woman behind her. And later she would know her name was Hazel, just, kind of shouting at her as she tries to enter just to go to school for the first day.
Wow. So it's obviously an intense story, an intense time for Elizabeth. What happened on the 40th anniversary of that day, that first day of school for her?
Well, the image that was taken of her with, holding her books and the crowd surrounding, it went viral in that day.
In that day,
right? Yeah. But literally all over the world, it became, and even to this day, is one of the iconic images of the civil rights struggle. Mm-hmm. Well, the woman, the young student, she was 15 at the time, high school student that was yelling at her, her name was Hazel. Mm-hmm. And the 40th anniversary of that desegregation, the photographer who took the picture reached out to both Hazel and Elizabeth to see if they would consider, meeting and talking and taking another picture to kind of symbolize our progress as a nation.
Right.
Well, they agreed to do that. They had corresponded, or before Hazel had apologized in the past. But this was the first time that they really met and talked in any depth. And it started a 2-year friendship that, just seemed to be symbolic of, the way that we could move forward as a nation in terms of some of the healing that needed to happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you tell this story. It's obviously a powerful one. Mm-hmm. What does this story have to say to people who follow Jesus? How can that connect there? Yeah,
well, the amazing thing is, one, the gospel both anticipates and responds to tension and racial division. We see from the very beginning that, the vision that Jesus says, even in, Acts 1:8, when he says, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, and Samaria, to the othermost parts of the world. Those were categories of how people felt themselves as different, right? The Jews and the Samaritans, the Gentiles. And so the picture that we get in the New Testament is that one of the great reveals that we see in the book of Acts is that all of what the church is supposed to be is about how do we come together in spite of our differences and be able to move forward. And how does the gospel speak to some of the injustices that are in our world that we have to speak to for us to come together? And so that story of even just, two people, one who is very much impacted and even hurt and offended by the actions of the other who felt shame, Hazel, about what she did, for them to be able to come together was a great picture of what could be if we were to do the same thing in our individual and collective efforts.
Right, we pay attention. So what? This is obviously an important topic. What is the problem that you personally see in the Christian church recognizing a need to have racial unity?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the book Divided by Faith, which I would definitely recommend for anybody who's trying to understand and kind of move forward. But in the book, they actually had this startling statistic. They noticed that when they surveyed African-American Bible-believing Christians, over 56% said that race issues and discrimination were a major problem in our country. When they surveyed white Bible-believing Christians, the number was down to 16%.
So 40% difference.
40% difference, which in statistics is a huge
a big
difference.
deal.
And so the book kind of unpacks and explains why. And one of the main issues is that we tend to see things from our own perspective and without a historical context, right? So, we see, and, we could celebrate, King Holiday and go, oh man, we've come so far, but without actually, understanding the full depth of the problem. But first is just even acknowledges they're a problem, so when you can't even have agreement on that, you can't even move forward with how to solve the problem that some are saying doesn't even exist.
Yeah, it's not there. Yeah, okay. So how does, specifically as Bible-believing Christians, how does the gospel speak to these issues?
Yeah, well, the cool thing is, like as I mentioned, the gospel anticipates and responds to this division. And we see that very early throughout the early church in the book of Acts. One story in particular really stands out to me in Acts chapter 6, right? So this is just, in the very early stages of the church. The chapter begins by just making a basic statement. It says, a complaint arose among the Hellenistic Jews toward the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. So what they're saying is the problem. Okay, so at that point, the church was taking care of widows because they had no means for which to take care of themselves. They couldn't get a job and things like that. And so they were providing food and resources. Now, Hellenistic Jews, that meant that they were from the Greek world. They were dispersed from all over, which meant that they didn't speak Hebrew like the Israeli, the Jews from Israel. They spoke Greek. They looked different. Their customs were different. Their experiences were different. We're not told exactly why those widows were neglected. We just are told that they were, and that it was a complaint that arose. The fascinating thing is what happens. The disciples, who themselves were Hebraic Jews, right? So they are part of the category of the leadership that is essentially being criticized. They gather the people together, and they listen to the complaints. And as a result of listening to the complaints, they come up with a solution. Their solution is to empower leaders to actually distribute the distribution fairly and evenly across the board. The fascinating thing is when it lists the names, sometimes you read like a list of names in the Bible, it can just, you kind of eye roll and get tired.
Right.
But this time it's important because all of the names are Greek and Roman names, right? So it's clear that they select Hellenistic Jews to do this. And it says that this pleased the whole congregation. And as a result of that, the gospel, it says, spread further. And in fact, Acts chapter 6 is really the turning point where you see Stephen, the first one who's martyred, is one of the one of the ones that are chosen to do the distribution. And the very next chapter, you see his ministry unfold, and and then the church grow from there. So it's a gospel issue, one, because it was how unity was able to happen when they dealt not just with an individual issue, but with a structural problem. Okay. But then two, because once they did that, it unleashed people who previously were maybe being overlooked from leadership.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Interesting to view scripture that way, looking at it intentionally instead of just the story. And like you say, like even running past the names and kind of rolling your eyes, that kind of stuff. So how can that relate to us today? What steps can we take today?
Yeah. Well, I think there's three, important steps. The first is just to do what the disciples did. They listened to the complaints. And oftentimes when someone has a complaint, we can become very defensive and feel like, okay, I'm personally being attacked. And so I want to respond and tell why this thing isn't happening. So instead, they didn't say, you know what, privilege doesn't exist. What are you talking about? As Hebrews, we're being persecuted just the same. No, they listened and they said, oh, okay, I can see why this is a problem. The next thing they did is they led by example. They led by example by actually empowering people to respond and to say, hey, this is what we think the solution should be. We need to have some people that can relate and communicate to our needs. And then the third thing they did is they let go. They let go of their own power, their own, voice, to give other people a voice to be able to speak into it. Because for these guys to be selected to do the distribution, that meant somebody had to be unselected.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, to do it. And but when they did those three things, it says it pleased the whole congregation, and the word of God spread as a result. And so I think those are three important steps that we can take to just model what that is: to listen, to lead by example, and then to let go.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So you're talking about some of the steps we could take by listening, leading by example, and then letting go of some of our power. What have been some of your personal experiences where you expected things to be a little bit better amongst the Christian circles that maybe perhaps were not in a surprising or maybe a common way?
Yeah, well, one thing I remember just when I was in college, and I was just, I went to a predominantly white institution and was like, hey, I'm just going to enjoy college. I'm just excited about things. I chose to live in a dorm that the focus was African American culture and literature, which, in light of the fact that those were things I never learned about, just in history in school and class, it was just a big gap. I chose to live there, and just kind of, they had a lot of different programs and speakers that would come in. Okay. But then throughout the year, there would be a lot of pushback from white students, like, why are the black students segregating themselves? Why are they separate? Like, they're the problem. And we oftentimes found that we had to defend, just the desire to, just learn and, and connect with ourselves in a culture that was, relating and relevant to us. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that when people are not aware of their own cultural background, it makes it feel like you're doing something extra when you're actually just living out, who you are. And so I think that can oftentimes happen even when we get together, and, the different music that's being selected, or the different communicators, or even the topics. All of these things are things that are informed by our cultural background and our backdrop. And so what has been helpful and what's been encouraging is when, there have been people who have decided to learn. And that's been the biggest thing, is that, we live in an era where you could literally Google just about anything. Yeah. And become, very well versed on the topic. Mm-hmm. And so there really isn't a reason why someone wouldn't be more aware of, the different things that are going on, the history. And so, but it's been really encouraging when, I've shared Divided by Faith. I got a text actually today from somebody I was talking to, and they said, hey, I just ordered the book. I recommended a podcast, and they're like, hey, I'm going to check that out. And so those type of things of just being able to listen, and then also advocate and push back on things that are said out of or done out of ignorance. Those are things that have really been meaningful to me, because I know that it's a risk involved, and it's uncomfortable to kind of, with friends, with family, someone says something at a dinner table that is, insensitive, or that's just, a stereotype, and pushing back against those things. That can be difficult to do, and it's something that it speaks volumes. It says the gospel. It demonstrates the gospel in a way of what it means. This is what Paul did when you have the guy who's the Pharisee of Pharisees, the most, religiously observant guy on the planet, who's persecuting Christians because they seem to be relaxing the law. And then when he meets Jesus, now he's the foremost advocate for the very group of people that he was repulsed by, the Gentiles. And now he's speaking up. And when there's attempts to limit their freedom, he's fighting against that. And so that kind of advocacy and it's the same thing that we see in Acts chapter 6. They didn't just go, oh, I'm sorry, that's a shame that your widows are being neglected. They say, hey, what do we do about it? How do we fix this? And those type of things are really encouraging.
So you tell us this story about Elizabeth Eckford and Hazel who connect, and it seems like a great story, like it ends there. Tell us a little bit more about the rest of the story.
Unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. In interviews after that, Elizabeth shared that their friendship only lasted about 2.5 years. Because what would happen is, over time, as they would do interviews or they would talk to each other, Hazel would reinterpret history to not feel so bad. So she would say things like, I kind of have amnesia. I don't really remember what happened or what I did, or, hey, this one moment doesn't define who I am, so let's not talk about it anymore. And so it, in a sense of trying to create this comfort level with herself, she ended up diminishing Elizabeth's pain in her story. And Elizabeth had a very powerful thing to say about that. She said, the only way that we can move toward racial reconciliation is by understanding our shared past and our shared pain and experiences. We have to go there if we want to move forward. And that's the same thing that's true in our present circumstances. And so, they, at this point, they're estranged still because there was a refusal to continue to press in to kind of that hard issue.
So when you were quoting Elizabeth and what she was saying about her connection to Hazel, you used the term racial reconciliation. Why don't you talk a little bit about what that means and why maybe it might be not the appropriate term to use?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, and I think part of it is it means something different to different people. In that same way that we saw that 56% to 16% difference in terms of if, race and racism was even a problem. So unfortunately, for many people, what racial reconciliation has come to mean is, hey, for some weird reason, we have differences and separation. So let's just put people together and kind of, can we all get along and just kind of learn from experiences, kind of laugh about how our music styles are different, and then kind of keep it moving. And that's really not sufficient to really move forward toward unity and healing. It's much like in the case of Elizabeth and Hazel, we have to get to a place where we're not just talking about differences for the sake, but we're talking about a shared past of pain, of privilege, of disadvantage, of people being marginalized. And so in that sense, some people even say, really, racial reconciliation is a misnomer because there was never conciliation in the first place. Like there's always been a strife and a difference. So what we're trying to do is actually have racial conciliation and try to bring together that which had never been together. And so I think from a spiritual standpoint, we have the answer in terms of understanding that we have a shared, ancestry and unity in Christ. And so that's able to move forward. But in order to do that, we have to get to a place where we are able to recognize the legacy and the impact of things that happened in the past in terms of how do we move forward, right? Like if someone had been abused, by a parent or a loved one, we wouldn't just say, okay, well, let's just get to the table and talk about our shared differences. Like we have to talk about that painful past and deal with those things, and also recognize how those things continue to impact us today in terms of creating the inequalities that we see. And so in Divided by Faith, one main way that they talk about is to realize that we can't just look at it from an individualistic lens. We also have to look at the structural inequalities that exist.
Corporately.
Yeah, and look at corporate, realities of how what relates to race and ethnicity. And once we see those two things together, then we can understand that there's still challenges that we face. There's still inequalities that are real in our world, even as it relates to education and other issues, that we have to be able to understand and embrace those things so that we can hear those things, hear those complaints, and then have a proper response.
Yeah, I think in today's culture, it's problematic with thinking as groups because everything is so individualistic. Right. Yeah. Would you say that the differences in terms of the lines of people who are majority culture and minority culture, do they think about those things differently, individualistically?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a great Christian scholar. His name is Dr. Carl Ellis. And he talks about the A side and the B side of the gospel. And the A side he talks about is basically what he calls is the epistemological side, which is a big word to just say, how do we know things, right? How do we know about God? Theology, right teaching, understanding. But then he said there's a B side of the gospel that relates to ethics. And the ethics is, how do we live in light of those truths? Mm-hmm. Well, when one is in the majority culture or a dominant culture, the system of how the world works, how society works for that person. And so they can think in a very individualistic lens to just go, hey, it's about my salvation. It's about me walking with Jesus. It's about, individual. But when one is in a marginalized space, then you understand that the system doesn't work for you. Yeah. And so you're desiring for Jesus not only to save the soul, but to also redeem the culture, to make it so that there's space for me. So for example, it was years before I realized that Band-Aids were supposed to be flesh colored. I just thought somebody just randomly picked a color and just said, oh, this is a cool color for a Band-Aid. You know what I mean? And then I started to realize, oh wait, that's supposed to actually look like somebody, but it didn't look like me. And so, that's something just on a superficial level, but just kind of gives a picture of like, hey, you don't have to think about that when it looks like you, but when it doesn't, then, you're more aware of the fact that there are challenges, there are ways in which, that we have to see everything be redeemed and come to the knowledge of Christ, not just individuals, but systems as well. And that was the whole point of the civil rights struggle, right? Like there was a systemic problem, segregation, that was intrinsically unequal. And unfortunately, we still have a lot of those challenges today.
Yeah. So I would imagine that our students, our audiences are in very different places, depending on their history, where they come from, and what culture they are. When it comes to racial unity. What encourages you as you think about our students, what they're learning in the future?
Yeah, I'm very encouraged when I think about the conversations that we're having as staff and crew, and then also the conversations that I engage with students when I have these, when I bring these topics up and when I teach. We were, just recently at a conference, and students were just coming up to me and just talking to me like, hey, I want to learn, I want to understand how we can bridge these gaps. And so I'm encouraged by the desire that there is to create a space where everybody is welcome and at the table. And also more of a willingness to be able to be self-aware, because we all come with a cultural paradigm and baggage, you could even say, that comes with that. The challenge is when we're not even aware of our own paradigm. We just think of it as normal and others as unique. But when we start to realize, hey, I'm coming from a unique perspective too, what is informing that perspective, and what is even my, history? Even something as simple as Ancestry.com, is even helpful. When people are starting to look at their family tree and realize I'm not just white, I'm English, I'm Irish, and all of these things, that is helpful for people to understand, what is behind a lot of their even cultural, norms and values. But we have to do that from a historical standpoint when we look in our country too, and see what's behind some of the inequalities that we experience.
Yeah. Rasul, thank you so much for talking with us about this, and exploring some of these topics that we maybe just ignore or don't realize are things that we need to be thinking about as believers and engaging with and pressing in. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.